approved in all the major export markets. So you see some law and action change. The US, the argument is you see some change, but without much legal reform. Right? In Europe, you see lots of legal reform without much change. Okay. The fifth argument, chapter 6, is the role of WTO litigation. They hold Europe, they avoid having to apply any of the substantive law provisions of the WTO regarding risk assessment and other. The holding was that Europe was engaged in undue delay of approval. So they said, you've got to at least make a decision with respect to the, quote, moratorium, the ban on approvals. And then, though, the US can come back and restart a case if you say no. But it's basically, Europe lost the case for engaging in undue delay, but it took 3 years, a 1,000-page decision, and the United States, if they decide to disapprove a product, must restart the case from scratch. Okay? And there, of course, is no penalty, no sanction whatsoever here for the undue delay, at least so far. The U.S. is trying to see if it can retaliate in some way, but so far has not. Okay. Our argument is the impact of politics on judges on judicial interpretation. We argue that they want to avoid unnecessary conflict with international regimes where they can, even if they don't specifically apply those regimes. It's a legal realist approach. You don't look at just what judges say, you look at what they do. They avoid social contestation where they can, and their concern is with member compliance. So they're trying to push the EU to actually restart its procedures, right? And they're hoping that maybe that they can empower certain actors domestically in the EU through using these new procedural mechanisms to reduce conflict. I went over that very quickly, but okay, to conclude, we see real limits of international law where you have entrenched path-dependent patterns of interest in institutions. But even here, we see a role for international law and international organizations. They help the United States and Europe to manage this regulatory conflict. It became an issue of legal disputes, right, as opposed to the U.S. being under a lot of pressure to retaliate by raising tariffs against the United States right away. The U.S. was able to fend off that pressure to retaliate by bringing a legal case and letting things defer for over 3 years, right, maybe more. They came up with some common principles, and codex have come up with how to conduct a risk assessment. In the OECD, they've come up with sort of the agreement with respect to basic traits of GMOs. And perhaps over time it can lead to greater accommodation of difference. The United States simply accepting that Europe's going to have a certain a different approach. But also Europe, through these new processes, potentially empowering domestic actors who have similar ideas and interests, who actually want, there are interest groups in Europe who would like to see GM crops, especially the animal feed industry. They want these products. They put a lot of pressure on political actors to approve them. The big story here, the last chapter of the book ends with developing countries. Brazil become a major grower. China is becoming a major grower of certain varieties, as India. Many of these cases, they started off through pirated seeds. Peasant farmers grabbed these things and because they thought that they were more efficient, and then the government, which initially had banned them, had to adapt to reality. That happened in India, it also happened in Brazil. Overall, though you've been developing countries, you see a lot of variation. They're really caught between the United States and EU pressures. The big normative issue I touched on in terms of democracy and these threshold rules and how those have affect decision-making within other countries, which ultimately will affect the future of agriculture as we know it.
So questions?
I would like to know, so the title of your book, When Cooperation Fails, implies that there's some kind of goal that's not being met. And I want to know kind of what that is and what is the core operation that the title is referring to exactly.
Yeah. Yes and no, right? In terms of cooperation is a question as to whether or not cooperation is a good or bad thing we never posit it is. our only question is, what are the conditions where cooperation is going to happen, or where it's not going to happen? Many people think that international cooperation can be a problem because it can be captured, right, by certain interests, et cetera. But many people think that cooperation in the global economy and global interdependence, because of the impact, taking into account the impact of one jurisdiction's regulation on the choices of other jurisdictions, is important. And so, and I believe that, right? So to the extent that you want some sort of forum in which parties whose regulation has external effects on those who are unrepresented within that jurisdiction, right? Then the question is, how do you get to that? Now, no one's saying that there's necessarily one right outcome, right? I have my own views, right? Others are going to have their own views. But if you can foster international fora which have some deliberation within them, as opposed to just having entrenched interests, and which are pressed to somehow take account of the impacts of their regulation on outsiders, and to see if, in fact, there's some ways where they can have common approaches to reduce those external effects, which are negative on outsiders, and that's a good thing.
My question is probably on the last part of your book, dealing with developing countries. This issue was being raised at the UN second committee, the Economic Committee, and there was a debate on it, particularly in relation with humanitarian assistance. Even U.S. was making condition for developing countries, including my own country, Ethiopia.
To which Ethiopia?
To accept food aid which is genetically modified, and where you have millions of people starving, you just don't have much negotiation power at all. So in view of that, and particularly given the differences that you outlined in Europe, where the public is probably more vocal as compared to the US, where the food companies are more stronger than the public view. Where do you place the developing countries, where mostly they are ruled by authoritarian regimes, which doesn't allow public opinion at all? And what is the fate of those people? Millions, billions probably.
Right. So first of all, I mean, there's huge variation, right? So whenever one speaks of developing countries, one really has to specify those. Not all of them are ruled by authoritarian regimes. Many are. So where they're, so the question, one question would be, does it matter, right? For instance, India, China, Brazil, right? India and Brazil are democracies, right? Flourishing democracies, imperfect democracies, but we all have imperfect democracies. Argentina's imperfect democracy, right? So, I mean, developing countries are, on the food issue, you probably know this, the easiest way to solve that problem is to tell countries that they should just give cash and then leave it to the developing countries to decide which food they buy, right? As opposed to saying, no, we'll give you food aid, but only our food, right? Which is what both Europe and the United States do, and they usually try to, and the U.S. has put what, would like to, its goal is for other countries to see that, to view GM grains as safe, right? And so it's going to use this as a lever, right, where it can. And Europe, of course, feels the same way, right, just on the opposite side. I mean, you also know that some countries refused U.S. food, Zambia being a big example, even where the U.S. apparently, you would know this better than I, agreed to mill the grain so it couldn't get into the ground. Because the question was, well, you could import the corn, but if the corn gets into the ground, then it could be a problem. I mean, or if the farmers got hold of the corn, then they could put it in the ground. And so the U.S. supposedly offered to actually mill it, and they still wouldn't accept it because they felt that it was a food risk, right, for people who were otherwise starving. So that became very controversial on all sides, right? But developing countries, my own view is that they're really caught on this. My own view is to give them if the Department of Agriculture has missions in all developing countries trying to get them to conduct pilot programs. Kenya created a pilot program that looked like they actually went through to approve a GM variety, which would have been adapted for Kenyan conditions that was supposed to increase yields. And then there was pressure by Kenyan NGOs in particular, and they stopped it. So, that's part of the Kenyan process. Whether or not that was a good decision in Kenya, a bad decision, you're going to have very different approaches, but that's the way it worked there. In India, for GM cotton, the very strong NGOs in India, there are thousands, right? They were very vociferously anti-GMO, but they had gotten the GMOs cotton banned, and peasant farmers got hold of pirate seeds and created mass protests, right, against the law, and then they forced the law to change. But there you had people. It wasn't a vote, right? It was just there was, they were concerned, right, about farmers being really upset, and there are a lot of farmers in India, cotton farmers. China has supposedly developed a GM rice variety, but they refused to release it because of concerns in I'm not sure if it's just global markets or their own concerns about environmental or health issues. The Philippines have been, in Indonesia, they've been trying to grow a GM variety, which is high in meeting vitamin A needs, and they have severe vitamin A deficiencies. And first of all, that was very difficult to get because it was an international food organization trying to create it, and it was a scientist in Switzerland trying to create it. There were NGO European protesters destroying the laboratories for creating this variety. And then there were also, they had to get something like 117 patent authorizations to make sure they weren't going to get sued for using it. But even there, the question of whether or not they'll be able to develop it in a way which really works in Indonesia, because each variety has to be tailored for local climatic and soil conditions. And the big problem is that it's called golden rice, but what it really looks like is yellow light rice, and people like white rice, and whether or not they'll eat yellow rice, even if it's supposedly better for them, is a real question mark. So, but all these issues are out there. My main concern would be how can you take account of developing countries' potential democratic choices to make their own decisions in a world of global markets, right, where they're dependent, where they're concerned about potentially, where they want to export. Okay. Yeah.
So, Greg, a lot of the talk is about public players, U.S. versus EU, member states of the EU versus other entities, developing countries, and that's all appropriate. It's largely about public international law. Yeah. But it obviously also affects private organizations. Monsanto, when they're launching biotechnology, trying to get their returns. Lots of European players. Could you comment, because it may be irrelevant, but I suspect that there's also substantial private international legal dimension to this. That is, there are private players who are engaged in negotiations, transactions, even litigations in front of different bodies. Is that,
yes,
if that is the case,
and we deal with that
what
too.
That's about, if anything,
we deal with that too.
briefly?
Yeah, so Monsanto has brought cases in Europe, and they've gone to the European Court of Justice with respect to, for instance, they brought a case in Italy with respect to a ban that the Berlusconi government had imposed, which went to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice, sort of, its decision, and you could say in many ways mirrored WTO decisions in terms of you must base your decision on a risk analysis. Italy had not had sufficient risk to be able to ban this. It went back before an Italian court, and the Italian court overruled the Italian ban imposed by the Italian Ministry of Agriculture. So there you have Monsanto working a national legal system which goes to a European regional legal system, which in turn applies international norms, and then that feeds back into the national system. Monsanto also, it's not just U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is in Africa, and all over Europe, saying, here's some free seeds, farmers, would you like to try them to see what your yields will be? They have to get, anytime you do a trial, you have to get approval from the national authorities. But they are very active in trying to get authorities to use their seeds. And there's some who claim that Monsanto really doesn't mind having pirated seeds at a certain point, right? Because what it really wants is it wants farmer groups to say these things are good, right? And then they can enforce later intellectual property rights. Yeah.
Well, the Swiss example of the NGOs, beating up on the labs aside, is some of the EU response then, is that just protectionism, waiting for their organizations to catch up with American?
It's not, and I mean that's when I actually presented this at Northwestern. You have a lot of sort of libertarian public choice type law professors there who said, well, of course this is just protectionism, but Europe has lost big time overall in terms of, I mean, the Commission and most of the elites, many of the elites, right, feel that that the amount of the millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in biotech that have left Europe. Europe had actually, back in the 80s, Europe was equal with the United States in biotech investment. Now it's nowhere close. And if you think about the dynamic economic effects over time, and the spillover effects of having that R&D taking place in Europe instead of the U.S., it's significant. So when Prodi was commissioner, then became prime minister of Italy for a while, but couldn't touch. In Italy, you can't even conduct a trial inside a laboratory, right, of a GM variety. And it's that strict. Which actually puts Italy at a disadvantage, because when it comes to deliberation, you're supposed to say, well, we've conducted our risk analysis. Well, they've never conducted a risk analysis even in a lab. Right? Yeah, I mean, did I answer your question? Yeah.
I have two questions. Maybe one is just want to visit the issue of developing countries, Africa in particular.
Yeah. And which?
Africa.
Africa, yeah.
You find that the laws that govern GMOs and related stuff are mostly the existing laws. They apply existing laws. But you realize that those laws are, built around the laws of the colonial governments. You find that the noise about these GMOs, usually, for example, most of them are the colonial history of European countries. And you find that most of them reject because Europe has not fully, these commercial GMOs. So Kenya, for example, when the institutions allowed and NGOs tried to ban that, was because they said they want to have a biosafety, laws in place, and they don't want to use the existing, laws. So that was the reason why it was banned after NGOs actually demanded that they should have biosafety laws in place before that. And most of that, I think Zambia also had the same case. So that was just a comment. I just want to go back to the issue of European countries, where you said kind of zero tolerance on imports. You find that that was with respect to grains, for example. But you find that in manufactured food, there was some kind of allowance, especially with respect to what they call advantageous presence or something.
Mm-hmm.
Where you find, for example, soybean is becoming kind of ubiquitous in terms of ubiquitous in terms of penetrating all the manufactured stuff. I think about 60 to 80% of manufactured now have some form of some elements of soybean. So there was about 0.9%, I think, tolerance level for that. And I think now they are trying to soften that ground, having repeal some of their laws, hunting laws. So where do you think are we going to head in the near future if Europe is trying to shift ground in terms of, they've already allowed some of this in terms of adoption, but talking about in terms of commercializing some of this. Do you think there will be some convergence in transatlantic?
Yeah, I mean, that's, and then, is the book's title wrong? Right? I mean, maybe over the long term, right? And we do say that they manage the conflict maybe over the longer term. I think that there's going to be long-term divergence in terms of, but there's a possibility opening for greater convergence. You would think, my long-run bet, depending on how long the long term is, and I may be dead, right? But my long-term bet is this technology is going to be accepted over time. That's my long-term bet. Forms of it. That usually that happens. Right? I think that in terms of the adventitious presence, right? If you want 0% GMOs in your processed foods, it's going to be probably very difficult to get. I mean, certainly anything that says organic GM-free in the United States, with the way winds blow, it's just very difficult. So it might have 0.009%, but it's, the idea that it's going to be 100% GM-free is going to be very difficult. And of course, people get very upset by that because, one, if you're saying that, there have been cases of farmers, right, whose organic produce has not been accepted because somehow adventitiously some GM seed got into their field. Right? But that's of course, it's hard to in a world where nature sort of has wind and water to say that anything's going to be 100% of a particular variety, right? Because things mix. The evidence that I've seen scientifically as to whether or not, biologically these things would take over, very difficult, just because they're not very hardy seeds, right? They're produced for high-scale agriculture. They're not produced to persist over time. Can I guarantee that? Can anybody guarantee that? No one can guarantee anything in the world. But the likelihood, there's no reason to think that it's going to be that high in my view. So the adventitious presence is, what would one agree with? What's enough, right? What's too much, right? Because if anybody accepts anything, right, it'll get there somehow, right, over time. It'll be small, right? You're trying to create buffer zones, right? Mandate buffer zones between fields, which could be big buffer zones. But it'll become more and more difficult. In terms of the laws, one just little wrinkle which we uncovered in how international law affects domestic laws. It's true that African countries look to Europe because, not only because that's where colonially the countries that dominated Africa, but also because they export much more to the European market than they do to the U.S. market. So they're much more concerned about European regulations than they are about U.S. regulations, which from a U.S. perspective puts the U.S. at a disadvantage with respect to Africa, right? It's not a big market compared to other markets, but it puts the U.S. at a disadvantage. But when they created the biosafety protocol, one of the fascinating things, which creates inter-domestic ministerial politics, is the biosafety protocol is all negotiated by environmental ministers. And the biosafety protocol, the Convention on Biodiversity, mandates you to pass new laws. And it creates technical assistance type programs to the environmental ministries. Environmental ministries generally are pretty weak in Africa, right? Well, they suddenly were granted through an international instrument some power, some regulatory power, whereas generally, whenever any food comes in and out of a country, that's the province of the Ministry of Agriculture. And the Ministry of Agriculture is what goes to the FAO and Codex. So you see sort of these own sort of, debates within developing country and African governments between different ministries, which are this, in terms of the creation of this new generation of laws.
I have a question.
I think we gotta go, right? After, is this
No,
what time?
we go up to 2 o'clock.
Okay, yeah.
Are there lessons in your analysis for better ways to introduce new technologies to avoid this kind of a problem?
Well, everybody's
Nanotechnology.
that's what everybody's asking. Are there any lessons with respect to nanotechnology? People are saying that there are certain lessons. I mean, some people really blame the producers, right? Monsanto of releasing, that they should have, I mean, of course Monsanto was just thinking about big agribusiness producers types in terms of the traits that they produced. And so some people will say, well, you know, you should really try to make sure that you can prove that there are widespread consumer benefits, right, of something, because it wasn't clear what the consumer benefits were of the first generation or the second generation of GM products. Others, you know, in retrospect, they're trying to go very slowly with nanotechnology. Some say that the U.S. and U.S. companies tried to force this too quickly down the throats of Europeans and created a very politicized issue, and they should have just gone much more slowly, right, in terms of trying to really pressure them. Now, you know, they tried in the OECD before this, which is a very technocratic type organization, to come up with some, they basically, I mean, the argument is that the OECD more or less took U.S. blue plates that the Reagan administration had created as to how to regulate GM foods, and then took it to the OECD, which then said this is the way the developed world should regulate this new technology. But you know, to what extent was it? I mean, nanotechnology, I'm not as aware of this now, but there's certain, you know, it's unclear whether or not in some ways Europe is going to be more, you know, friendly towards nanotechnology than the United States or less. No one really knows. And so maybe just, you know, trying to work through the same ways that they've been prescribing, which is through networks and trying to ease this technology and go slowly and not commercialize it and have major campaigns. But we'll see how it plays out. Yeah, one question, then we'll go back, yeah?
Just a quick question. I'm curious where Canada and Russia fall in the debate.
Oh, Canada is very much on the U.S. side. You know, large agribusiness, and you know, so it actually was a co-complainant with Argentina against Europe in the WTO case. Russia, I don't know where Russia is. It's funny, it didn't come up. I don't think Russia has not approved GM foods to my GM crops. I don't think it's approved GM crops. So far it's GM free.
Yeah. How you know that there's a technology and patents around this technology? How well founded is this fear that these corporations that are spearheading this technology will eventually, you know, mob all the seeds out there?
Mob what?
Mob all the seed grades.
Oh, create the mono agriculture.
Yes. Yeah. And decent farmers, for example, in Africa, have, you know, don't have anything to borrow from their neighbors to not see that in assistance.
Yeah.
How well funded is that field?
Of course, you know, it's a little bit outside of my, you know, specialty, but I have my opinion, right? I think your opinion on that question is also very closely linked to your opinion as to whether or not the Green Revolution was a good thing, right? So most agricultural scientists, right, will say the Green Revolution was, you know, a great thing, right? That it made it increased agricultural yields. It didn't touch Africa, right? So it's the great failure of the Green Revolution is that it did not touch Africa. But it was tremendous success in India, they'll argue, and led to being able to, you know, in a population, and China, rapidly growing population, to be able to feed them and thus reduce no starvation and reduce malnutrition. So it's a good thing. Now, the complaints about the Green Revolution were precisely that it would, this is high-tech seeds, right? New types of seeds. They weren't genetically modified, but they were new types of seeds, which farmers adopted on a mass scale. And so they were less likely to use a diverse assortment of grains, including those which have much lower yields. And they used different forms of agricultural techniques, including pesticide use, et cetera, in the Green Revolution. But And the concern was it would wipe out peasant farmers, you know, it would be to the advantage of large-scale farmers, et cetera. I mean, I have a positive view of the Green Revolution, right? So that, but when, for instance, when the FAO, the FAO, which is a UN body, the Director General is from the Sudan. And the Director General issued a statement, I believe in 2002, saying that we really need to look at this technology for developing countries. You know, he said, I'm not going to say whether or not the technology, you know, necessarily we should adopt it or not, but we really need to engage in trials to see whether or not we can create varieties which will enhance proteins, the vitamins, nutrition, enhance nutritional benefits of food, and enhance drought resistance for sub-Saharan Africa, and enhance yields. Immediately after that, he received a letter signed by, I can't remember, 1,000, 10,000 NGOs, right, saying, you know, attacking the FAO for taking a position that GMOs might be, you know, might be good for developing countries. And the FAO has treaded much more softly ever since that. I mean, there were big demonstrations outside the FAO, et cetera. So my own view is that, yeah, you should engage in trials. You should, the problem is that Monsanto is not going to engage in trials for the type of varieties that would be good for developing countries because there's no profits there. So you need public sector investment, and you need to try to work around patent rights, which are, to me, a challenge, so that you can develop. China is the only country so far to develop, besides the United States and Europe, to develop its own GM variety. But Brazil and India are investing serious money in GM technology. And so you have to have countries which have an interest in developing varieties which are of use for people in developing countries. Now, if you think GMOs are a terrible thing, of course, you won't take that position, but that's my own position. Now, whether or not, but then you need also money to conduct risk assessments and just make sure that, you know, that there are proper assessments that actually take place. But that's got to come from public authorities. And what's really interesting also that since the 1960s, the amount of investment in scientific research organizations to develop foods suited for developing countries has declined significantly. So for people like Jeffrey Sachs and others who are saying we need to increase development aid, that's one area where it has significantly declined, and where I think it could, you know, to invest in science and technology for crops production in developing countries, I think is very important. And to exclude from, I mean, to put that all in GM research would make no sense, but to exclude GM research from that, which would also make no sense, in my view. Yeah.
I was wondering about the extent to which indigenous rights and indigenous concerns were coming into play for WTO regulation and these international regulations of GMOs, because it seems to me that if GMOs are being targeted towards developing countries as a way to lift them out of poverty, that it's often the indigenous people that have the most to gain from global integration into the market, and they also have the most to lose in terms of their culture, because they're often it's agriculture that's one of the defining parts of their identity. So
it's so complex, right? So let me just give you a couple of examples, and unpredictable, right? You can't just, so one of the effects on the Amazon region is that when Europe tried to source its soybeans from Brazil instead of the United States, you had massive increase in soybean production in Brazil, cutting down large, you know, thousands of hectares, right, of the Amazon right now. Was that good for indigenous groups? Clearly not, right? Now, can you blame that on Europe? Well, I mean, it certainly was an impact, right, in terms of this, but, you know, maybe Brazil is going to produce, you know, and now actually Brazil has shifted. It first of all banned GM soy, and now it's accepted GM soy. So, you know, you got the worst of all worlds, right, depending on your perspective. You know, traditional knowledge, I imagine, could go different ways, right? To one extent, you found a gene in some you know, indigenous place, right, that it was used by a Monsanto or by another technology company, right? You know, maybe you could argue that some of those profits then should go to the indigenous groups. Or It's certainly a major issue, right, being discussed within, and there's a lot of academic literature. I'm much more skeptical about all of it, to be honest, but in terms of what can be done, right? But you know, there's international treaties on this, and the intersection of the Convention on Biodiversity and the protection of traditional knowledge and the TRIPS agreement there's a lot of literature out there, but not much, you know, no resolution whatsoever. Right?
I guess my concern is similar to yours, and that would be with biodiversity in the indigenous areas. I guess what has been your observations, or what has been the WTO's response to potentially a major loss of biodiversity in indigenous regions due to GMOs, or what they call LMOs?
Right. Well, or just opposed to the expansion of agriculture, right? So I would say that, you know, there are a lot of yields out there. I mean, it's also linked to the green revolution. So it's not just, and there, of course, there's only really 4 crops, right, which are grown using GM technology, right? So you're not talking, you know, I don't think you could blame it all on, I think that actually GMOs would be a minor part of that equation. You know, it's going to be really the expansion of agriculture and expansion of populations that is going to put the pressure on forests, non-GMOs. If anything, the pro-GMO argument is that to the extent that you have higher yields from GMOs, it'll reduce the pressure on forest destruction. So you'd have to at least take that into account, right, in that argument. Yeah.
Great, for the lawyers in the room, it sounded like at some point in Q&A you were saying some kind of change is gonna come to the legal regime that's gonna let some kind of form of GMO get into, GM foods get into Europe in some way. Maybe not the way that Monsanto wants it, but some way. Can, for the lawyers in the room, maybe for others, can you tell us what should we watch for in terms of a decision bubbling through, or some kind of a reform that maybe going through some of the organizations like WTO reform that helps us to understand how to reconcile contradictions with the biosafety standards? Just what should we be watching for in the near term?
Okay.
For the lawyers.
One, will the U.S. bring a second WTO case? Okay. There's briefs already written by Monsanto's lawyers sitting on the USTR's desks. So will the U.S. actually bring the case? I doubt it. Right? With the Obama administration, I doubt it. At least in the near term. They have a lot on their agenda right now besides pissing off another constituency, which, you know, but they're good. But that is something that the U.S. is using the current WTO decision and the threat of a new one to try to lobby with the European Commission to get better laws, which have nothing to do with what the actual GMO decision was about, but whenever you got a little bit of a stick, right, you use it for whatever you can get. So that's what's happening. So then the question is what's going to happen in Europe. In Europe, you have 2 things. One is the European Food Safety Authority is approving more of these, but there's pressure to change the criteria on which they are to approve genetically modified varieties, to look more closely at evidence produced at the member state level. For instance, Austria and the French, you know, are coming up with their own. They're creating their parallel scientific authorities. So you're going to have dueling scientific authorities in terms of whether or not a variety is safe. There's some pressure to make it easier for regions within Europe to be GM-free. Austria declared a third of its country GM-free. That was challenged and held to be illegal by the European Court of Justice under European law. But clearly that also, you know, international law is hovering on top of that. But there will be ongoing lobbying there. The other things to look for, and this is, I mean, we have this in the book, I didn't get to talk about it, but the political economy of regulation of putting GM in the ground are different than the political economy of selling GMs as food and feed. But once you permit GM as food or feed, it affects the political economy of GMs in the ground. That is, that if there's a lot of competition of GM foods and feed from the United States going into Europe, then European farmers are at a competitive disadvantage price-wise, and they will start to rethink about what GM regulation for putting in the ground. My own views is that European should be told, it's a totally democratic decision. If they don't want them in the ground, fine. If Berkeley doesn't want them in the ground, fine. If Madison, Wisconsin doesn't want them in the ground, fine, right? But, and we have those regulations in the United States, right? But if, but you change that, the lobbying interest, right? If you suddenly have major producer interests who are disadvantaged because their products now are more expensive on the market. And that's the reason why the NGOs don't want them to be approved for consumption, right? Because they want to keep the agricultural interests on their side. That's my analysis. But watch out for that, right?
Good point to stop at. Thank you very much. Paul, 2 weeks from today, on immigration.
Immigrants,
Immigrants.
remittances, and venture capital.